Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/ASW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome back, everyone, for the news of the week of June 24th. Of course, this is Application Security Weekly. Still here with Dan, who's hanging out on mute. He may chime in on a couple of these stories. And, of course, my illustrious co-host, Paul Asadorian. Paul, any of these stories catch your eye that you want to talk about first?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that Microsoft is not rewriting Office in Java, but is porting Skype to React Native. What does that mean for us?
So I thought that was kind of an interesting set of articles because what had come out recently, and let me just pull this up here. So that's under number 2 and number 3 under the if you build it, they will come section. So if you build it, I'm just pulling up the notes. So for number 2, there was basically a developer who had made some sort of post or something, I think it was to Reddit. And they basically said that Windows users are already used to JavaScript applications for like Microsoft Teams and Slack, which are Electron apps, and Skype is expected to soon be rewritten in React Native. But then, of course, there was some commentary around how, in this case, Teams and Office are both resource intensive, and a JavaScript version will likely be 10 times more resource intensive, right? They're basically saying, look, these are already resource intensive apps. They might be even more resource intensive, but maybe we can optimize with JavaScript. And there was a lot of confusion around what that meant, right? Because people are saying, what do you mean? Like JavaScript takes more memory, obviously, as we know, with Chrome, right? But at the same time, then they started looking at things like, hey, wait a minute. There's all these other apps that are being ported, like Skype is being ported to React Native, and Skype is a pretty intense application. Maybe Microsoft has figured it out, especially with the GitHub acquisition, who has the intellectual property to Electron, as far as I understand. So yeah, there was some back and forth. Basically, the developer chimed in on this Reddit thread and said, look, we're not abandoning C++ or C#. In this case, it makes sense to maybe get teams all working on the same or similar languages like TypeScript for React Native or JavaScript as well, because it means that as a resource utilization, right, as Dan was pointing out earlier, it's not easy to find C++ developers anymore, but there's a whole lot of JavaScript developers out there. Maybe we could actually make use of them and implement some of the different feature sets that we want with unified teams, right? So rather than saying, hey, look, I want a sidebar widget. Well, you've got a team that's developed all of the needs for implementing sidebar widgets, and it's all written in JavaScript. So it doesn't matter what application they write anymore. You suddenly need less developers, and in this case, a unified ecosystem of developers. So that was both weird and concerning to me. Dan, I don't know if you have any comments on that, given your comment earlier about trying to find C++ developers.
Well, I mean, Microsoft has a lot of them, but it's a battle right now. I mean, Google's, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, they're just eating up the C++ developers, and there's not a lot of good new ones. It's I don't know. There's a lot of old craggly guys, us fellow gray hairs, that are doing C++. But maybe that's a reason. I think they're probably just trying to figure out how to innovate and how to make Skype more relevant.
That's probably true as well.
I look at Skype from a user perspective, and I've been, Dan's been doing podcasts, or has a history of doing podcasts back in the day. I mean, we always used Skype, and I don't think there was ever a time where I was like, wow, they did a really nice job with the Skype user interface. Like, it's always been a complete train wreck, and we screened so many guests to come on the show of varying levels of technical proficiency or inefficiency or non-proficiency. And navigating the Skype interface is just awful. Like the user experience in Skype is just awful. If there's any hope that they could make that better, maybe this is it. I don't know. But if Microsoft continues the tradition of the Skype user interface, it will be awful. And I hope to change that trend someday because I like Microsoft today as a company. But they still have done just an awful job with Skype. I think it's terrible. Even the professional Skype products are just awful. And the user experience is awful.
JavaScript as a front-end development language is the de facto language for it today. I mean, to the extent that, Skype being rewritten in React Native, that's going to get interesting.
Yeah. I mean, even if it's a integration of the technologies, the core engine that does a lot of the heavy lifting is still done in C++ or C#, but the interface is JavaScript to make it a nicer user experience. I really think Microsoft would do a much better job and get more people using Skype. I think today, I got to imagine so many people are turned off because the user interface is ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they've got major competitors in the space today, like Zoom, and I think even Slack nowadays can do Slack calling, right? Like you have a unified chat interface plus calling and video. Right. They're probably looking at this and saying, look, if we don't innovate now, we're going to fall behind.
Yep. And they want to sell it as a business product too, and I bet you they can't or they're having a tough time because it's just awful user experience.
Yeah, maybe they wrap it up into Office 365.
And that's actually interesting because that may be one of the reasons.
What's that, Dan?
Yeah, and that may be one of the reasons why is that it would give them a chance to roll it in.
Right.
That also makes sense. Paul, where do you want to go next?
What was the other one? Oh, Lacework, the Lacework study that found 300 unsecured container orchestration dashboards, which was a relatively low percentage of all the dashboards that they found, which I still think is a relatively low percentage. And I'm not sure of how many orchestration dashboards there are in the world, right? I mean, they were able to discover something like 3,000 and 300 of them were unsecured. I can only imagine those numbers are going to grow unless there's some kind of campaign to educate people that you shouldn't leave some of this stuff wide open. But I think in this new space, certainly we've been bit by that as well. We're trying to implement new technology, not realizing what's open by default in those things. And when you're rapidly deploying this new technology, you can oftentimes miss that. And you have the best app scanner in the world, as Dan, gets up every day and tries to build and support. But, if you leave your container orchestration dashboard or your Docker API wide open to the world, like we did once accidentally, then it's game over. Like you don't need to do anything complex, right? Like you're just basically handing over the keys to the kingdom to the attackers. I thought that 300 number and that 3,000 number was pretty low.
So actually it was 321,169. Okay. So orders of magnitude difference.
Yeah, so that's probably more accurate. I found it that only 300 were unsecured. Like, does that mean people are doing a good job? Maybe by default, a lot of the orchestration dashboards are you have to work to open it up to the world, is what that tells me.
Well, so if you actually, for those of the listeners out there that are now trying to do the math in their heads, I'll save you some time. That's 0.014% of the actual dashboards that they found that were open to the internet. So, less than 2%, which is good. And if we're rounding down, it's just 1% out there that they found through Showdown. Still bad that they were out there, but at the same time, not so bad that they actually ended up being mostly secure. What I found interesting about some of the stats that they actually covered, though, was in this case, there was both Kubernetes and Docker Swarm instances. 76% of the container orchestrations discovered of that 21,000 number were Kubernetes, and then only the remaining was Docker Swarm. And I think that, Paul, you and I have discussed a little bit back and forth here on what to use from a container orchestration. And I think at one point I commented that it sounds like Kubernetes is taking over, but this number pretty much confirms it.
It tells me that people haven't moved from Swarm. When I talk to folks, it really seems like that Swarm is kind of going away and not receiving as much support as Kubernetes is. So that's just what I hear.
Well, the other thing that they pulled out of this data set as well was something like 95% of those that they discovered were actually living out on AWS, which I found interesting just because of the fact that I know Azure has the ability to support both Kubernetes and Docker containers themselves.
Right.
So I'm wondering if this is just orders of scale problem where Amazon just already has so much of this space and they're just keeping their customers, or if in this case people are just spinning things up in AWS to try them out and they happen to have discovered them or what have you. But that was interesting to me. Where do you want to go next?
Let's take a look at the man who was fired by a machine.
Oh yeah, this was an interesting one. So in this case, what ended up happening was it was a BBC article. So this is number 4 under the "If you build it, they will come" section. And so basically, it's a story of a gentleman who one day goes into work, and his name is Ibrahim Diallo, D-I-L-O, I think, Diallo is how he's spells his last name.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in any case, he basically went into work, and then he found that his key card had failed. So it's like, okay, this isn't the first time this has necessarily happened. I'm sure you've probably experienced that from some of your physical pen test operations that you might have run, Paul, where you're like, oh yeah, key card failed, follow somebody in. So in the process of kind of his day, though, he ends up going up to his office, and he can't get into his office, so somebody lets him in, and he's using his computer, and then it gets locked out of his computer. And then later in the day, like, people come by and basically get him to leave, and he talks to his boss, and his boss said, look, like he says, I was fired. And they're like, I don't know what's going on. I can't stop any of this. It says you've been, terminated. And so it kind of escalated up through the company. And what they found was, in this case, the original manager to Ibrahim was recently laid off. And Ibrahim was a contracted employee, not like a full-time salaried employee. And the original manager who was laid off had not checked a box on one of their ticketing systems that would keep his contract alive after, basically this person was let go. And so what ended up happening thereafter was this automated kind of, removal system to remove access, to basically get him to leave his office, etc., was kicked on. And effectively, no matter what his manager or what anybody up the chain could do to say, no, he's not fired, the system would automatically come back and say, no, yes, he is fired. And after a series of weeks of being off the job, AI was effectively what caused him to be fired because of just one missed check box. So talk about automation to the extreme. Paul, this is the first I've ever heard of anything like this. You listen to the news, or you pay attention to some of this news a lot more than I do. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Well, I mean, sometimes systems just don't like to close the pod bay doors. I mean, what are you going to do? He's obviously fired, right? I think there was an X-Files episode about that too, right? It basically takes over. Well, a couple things. I mean, one, good for this company to have great policies about, termination of people and automating the process. Bad that they don't have a way to undo that and have some kind of manual override. That was obviously missing from their threat modeling and their planning, for this particular process. I also think that poor security on the company's part, that if he was fired, like, how did he get all the way into the building and sit at his computer? They need to probably review their policies so that employee, that if he was actually terminated on purpose, that the employee wouldn't get all the way to his computer, because that could be really bad. So while they did have a good process for automation, it failed in practice. I think there's a huge lessons learned for this company on both sides of it, right? To put some kind of safeguard in place, and also to shore up their policies that when someone is laid off, that they don't get let in the building. So they kind of failed all around. Good intentions, but if they do a lessons learned, they can improve this process tremendously.
Yeah. Well, so ultimately, at the end of this, basically, what ended up happening was they said, do you want your job back? And he said, no. Like, I was treated so poorly by this whole situation that, like, I'm good. And so he basically moved on to another job after 3 weeks of not being paid and being let go due to a fault of this automation system.
Wow.
I do like the quote there. It says, the system was out for blood, and I was its very first victim.
Yeah. Yeah, it's right out of a science fiction movie or TV show.
Yeah, right. No kidding. So where do we want to go next?
Well, let's talk about Google plugins, Chrome plugins rather, extensions, because that's really I think a hot button issue. It's very concerning for me, as we've discussed on the show before, how there's this entire ecosystem similar to WordPress plugins, similar to other kind of add-on and plugin systems that can spell disaster for that particular technology. And we've seen a string of attacks against Chrome add-ons. So what's the latest?
So in this case, what it looks like they're doing here is they're actually going ahead and following kind of the closed garden or walled garden model of Apple. So what they've said is that they're basically saying with the next version of Chrome, I think it's 71, that you can no longer install third-party extensions into the browser, right? You have to go through the Chrome store. Mm-hmm. And what I found kind of interesting about this is there's a tie-on, like an additional link right next to it that is Dan Gooden's take on this problem, because ultimately they can go ahead and improve transparency by getting more things into the Chrome store and perhaps even enforcing, better security checks, etc. But as Dan Gooden points out on Twitter with that extra link, there's 4 different articles citing Chrome extensions in the Chrome web store that were malicious and had to be removed. So I think that, in this case, with what Chrome is trying to do, it's a smart move. The fact that they're trying to limit the exposure is maybe a phase 1 of a 2-phase or 3-phase approach, which is get everybody in the same ecosystem, then clean the ecosystem, or come up with a way of detecting bad extensions, and then clean the ecosystem.
Right.
But first, you got to get everybody in the same place, which is same thing as we were talking about on the break, Paul, with version control. You got to get all the code in the same place so that you can know what's wrong, and then push it into staging and push it into production. So they're effectively gathering all their eggs at this point into one basket.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a valid point. Like, force everyone into a walled garden, make sure it's actually a walled garden. But, with all the Chrome add-ons that exist today, they can't do that all at once. And I think they'll hopefully be working in tandem, right? Collect all of them, say everyone's got to go through the Chrome store, and then roll out processes to say how they're going to validate the code, what the approval process is going to look like. I think we sorely need that. I think it was enough of a problem that Google had to make the decision to basically clean it up. And hopefully they move towards that goal while still allowing for some innovation. It all depends on what that process is going to be to get your Chrome plugin approved. But I think it's a welcome change. It may slow down innovation temporarily, but I think it's a welcome change because there was too much of a trend of malicious add-ons for Chrome.
Well, the other side of it is this, though, Paul, right? We've seen issues where people have gone and basically bought the intellectual property of an extension and then pushed out, malicious changes thereafter, right? And that was, again, I think, through the Chrome web store. So it is a good approach to get everything in, but it's almost like the horse has already left the barn, and now all of their users are used to this process. And I think that they're probably going to get some pushback here, which is unfortunate because, as Apple has shown, if you can contain as much of this as possible, you can actually have a very secure system. But for the longest time, I think because Chrome has set this precedent, or Google has set this precedent, I imagine that their user base is going to be, pissed off more than anything else. So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
I'd be curious to know how Apple deals with that problem of, the owner of the app. Like, what happens if their keys get taken over or something gets taken over? Like, what's their detection mechanisms? What's their process if an app, isn't updated or they're unable to contact the owner? Like, is there some kind of process for that? Because that is, Keith, that is a valid concern that we have with all kinds of code that we talk about in the show, is like, what happens if the developer abandons a project or it gets taken over or it changes hands? How do you ensure that chain of custody, that the code is still going to have that same level of integrity, and how do you retest that, essentially?
Yeah, that is a problem of scale as well, right? So think about how many people are trying to put extensions into the web store, and then the amount of kind of fast feedback time that you need to say, oh, this was approved, or is it going to take 3 weeks for me to put forward a version, put it into the web store, get it approved to finally be able to be used by people that are using the browser? But by then I might have 2 or 3 new versions that I've already I'm ready to release that I still have to go and get approved. So yeah, Apple seems to be doing a good job of it. I don't know what their turnaround time is like today, but I think it's within a few days at least that you get some sort of notification that you've been accepted. So yeah, hats off to Google. If anyone has the development team in place to be able to build this quickly and then, scale it, it's probably Google.
Right.
So
well,
where do you want to go next?
Certainly they've got a good track record with Android. Oh, no, wait.
Yeah.
Never mind. So this guy, Nick Craver, broke Stack Overflow. Do we have any more details on that?
Yeah. So he actually, it's a Twitter thread. So what happened was one night I was reading through Twitter, as one does. And as I was reading through it, basically this gentleman, Nick Craver, who's a developer at Stack Overflow, pushed a bad bit of code into production. And so he said, look, I'm rolling out a fix right now, this minute. And in the process of that conversation, he actually discloses some of the things he did, right? So first he tells, after about 4 minutes into it, he says look, we've got the main metas back online. And then he said, I'm not sure about the immediate cause, but an HTTP lib switch missed an init call from a bad rebase, which only showed after about a 30-minute caching expiration. And it throws an async error in the background, which effectively was pointing to void. And so all of their unit tests, all of their integration tests, all of their processes in place didn't catch any of this. And so at the end of the day, when it made it into production, after about 30 minutes in, the async call that threw a void had nowhere to pass the error back to because it's a void, right? It doesn't exist. Or at least the pointer is pointing to something that's just empty space, or it's it's a space that hasn't been allocated in this case to your process. And so it ends up causing a seg fault and crashing the entire system, which was crazy because in this whole thread, he just kind of goes into this whole situation related to how it happened, a PR. He even had posted up a PR image of how he goes about fixing this with the pull request inside of what looks like VS Code, the whole nine. Yeah, so it was cool. It was kind of neat to see live development or incident response, I guess, of bad code push. So yeah, I don't know if anyone caught this. It was on June 12th. I don't know if this has time of day. It doesn't look like it has time of day listed here. At about 12:40, so midday Eastern time on June 12th. If anyone had experienced outages, it was Nick Craver, but he also happened to fix it. So thanks to Nick.
Thanks, or not thanks, maybe. At least he fixed it. Right. I mean, it goes to show you that code can always be broken.
Yeah, like you wouldn't believe.
Yep.
Speaking of broken code, I wanted to cover just a few learning and tools that I put into this week's show notes. So number one was a deploy to Azure with Docker and VS Code. So if you happen to have broken some code and need to quickly redeploy that back out to Azure, it was a link from the VS Code documentation that shows you the entire process, start to finish, of installing Docker, getting the Azure App Service extension up in place, and then walking through pushing your code directly into Azure via VS Code, which I was pretty switched on about just because I love VS Code, I love Docker, and I know that with Galen that you had on the other night from Pulse Security Weekly, Azure is doing some really cool stuff. So it's kind of perfect package, right? Get all of your code in your version control system by way of VS Code, which is pretty smooth, and then just push it right into production via VS Code. You don't even have to leave your editor anymore, Paul. Cats and dogs living together. It's a wild west out there. Any thoughts?
No.
Cool. So the other one that I thought you might like, though, was there's an open source tool called Starter. It's an open source Docker file generator. So basically what you do is you just kind of install this, you call up Starter, and then it gives you the Docker Compose YAML file, the Docker file, the whole nine in terms of getting your Docker files set up for your application. It's just kind of a build system, I guess, for building Docker files.
Yeah, that's cool. My whole thing is, though, before you use this tool, make sure that you've written your own Docker files and Docker Compose scripts by hand and understand what it does first before you go implement, this kind of tool. I think it's really important. Well, there's so many tools out there that can help us automate things, and I think some gravitate towards those without learning the fundamentals and spending the time and frustrating and have it fail and understand why it fails. And if you don't do that, you can create a big mess and take down Stack Overflow or something like that.
Right. And you're absolutely right, Paul. I mean, with the changes that they've even made to Docker Compose and all of the way that networking now works in Docker, for example, right? To have a true appreciation for the tool, you kind of have to use it first.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those situations where for those people that are, tasked with building endless Docker files for their applications that they're now pushing into containers, guess what? If you've done it once, maybe twice, maybe 20 times to actually know what you should be doing and how it should work, here's a tool to help you automate some of that process and say, look, devs, just use this. I'll go in and clean it up after, which, puts together at least some of the process into getting this built at scale, which is the problem.
Well, yeah, and I think you hit an important point, especially when you're working with Docker Compose. Like the version number matters a lot. And if you're using a newer version number and something's not working, you have to understand what you wrote originally to be able to port that over to the new version. And there have been some significant changes, especially with Compose, in the version numbers that you have to be aware of.
Yeah, well, that's the entire other problem, right? Like for me, I remember writing things in one version and then going into another open source project and, trying to containerize it using a different version, and everything just got messed up fast.
Everything's different.
Yeah, it was like, it wasn't in Kansas anymore, Paul. It was very strange.
I had to troubleshoot that one day for our production team. It sucked.
The pain is real. The struggle is real.
Struggle is real.
Speaking of debugging, by the way, number 3 under the learning and tools, there is a debugging JavaScript guide for both Google Chrome, if you're using, Chrome in this case, and Visual Studio Code, which is something that I've recently started doing, just to play around with a nice book, as I mentioned earlier, for learning JavaScript is You Don't Know JS. I've talked about it before on the show. It is an open source GitHub repo, so we'll have to go back and find the version number, or episode number for that. But in this case, it's a nice way to go ahead and actually go through the process of debugging your JavaScript code in VS Code. The last one that I wanted to mention, though, and again, another open source tool, it's called List Lambdas, right? So for all those forward-leaning companies out there that are focusing on, functional code out as serverless on, Amazon or Azure, it's a nice tool to actually give you an idea of usage of those Lambdas, changes to those Lambdas, and just kind of a nice little terminal-based heads-up display of the Lambdas that you've leveraged, right? So if you have a Lambda that's used maybe, once a month, and it's suddenly being used 100 times a day, you might want to check on who's using it and why, because maybe it's an entry point for, an attack of some kind, or maybe somebody's exfiltrating data through it. So it was a cool tool that I thought was perhaps useful for some of our forward-leaning listeners.
Awesome.
So yeah. With that, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us for this week's episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git, commit, and stay classy.